begin this program of The Scramble, I want to level with you with what this new format consists of. I'll be starting off this program providing you with a story we at The Scramble feel is pertinent to the current climate we are in. We might discuss some sort of controversy or issue and sort out the possible reasons or takeaways from the problem. I will provide facts as well as editorialize just a bit, both of which are free for scrutiny of anyone that wants to give it. I do not claim to be a genius, nor do I claim to always be right. I will not claim to have the moral high ground without stating my own hypocrisies, for I too am yes human. The only truths we hold on to on The Scramble is that we will seek what is a fair assessment of the world and the beings that consist within it.
An effort to regain America's moral stature in the world.
But let's go back to a couple other presidents. President George W. Bush said he'd fully fund the Pell Grant program, which he froze in the fiscal quarter of 2005 in his education budget. He promised to pay the national debt down to a historically low level. But as of the following July of that statement, the national debt stood at $7 trillion, which was a record high. And last but not least, he promised to, quote, lock away the Social Security surplus for just Social Security, while he'd eventually use $159 billion of those funds in the first fiscal year of 2002. Bill Clinton said he'd reform the national health care system, which he couldn't get its day in Congress. He said he'd work for homosexuals in the military, which following his days in office signed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which has been seen retrospectively as a misunderstood reform approach to homosexuals in the military. And George Bush Sr. has become immortalized by his broken promises that he made with 3 stirring concrete words.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
That unemployment, which equals 93.8 million Americans. Now, it might shock you if I told you out of Clifton, Obama, and Trump, none of them are wrong. Let's start with Mr. Clifton's point. Now, Mr. Clifton is trying to demonstrate the point that when we count a version of unemployment, we count those over the age of 22 who are seeking jobs in the labor force and haven't found work. That number is somewhere around 8.6 million Americans out of work. The point Clifton is trying to make is that we measure unemployment upon 6 different points of measurement. The moment we all begin to have a civil discussion using the same numbers, that's the point when unemployment goes from an amorphous mass of scary and confusing numbers to something we all can collectively understand. And maybe, just maybe, if there begins to be a news media that begins to count the same numbers and have a discussion based on the same statistics, maybe that's one more good job we should count. When in private, Nixon provided a historic example of a president not blaming the past 2 guys for a war that came to define that part of the century as well as remain as a blemish on his legacy. But I feel like we are not making a good case of showing this is an American tradition if I just use modern American presidents. So let's go back to 1776, where a cut piece from the first draft of the Declaration of Independence where future President Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, blamed the cruelty and existence of American slavery on the guy who ruled before, King George III, saying this, quote, "He opprobrium of the infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain his execrable commerce." Even going further back, we can find our first American settlers of Virginia in the mid-18th century blaming the growth of Anglican religious change in America on the ineptitude of the leading ministers before them. Quote, "The Virginia gentry blame growth of religious dissent on the long-claimed incompetence of the Anglican ministers." Now, those founding principles would go on to dictate religious culture in America as a whole, and just like those dynamic principles defined American culture, our American tradition of blaming the guy who was in charge before us is obviously not an issue that we have tried to resolve, but rather a rite of passage for every American as well as American president. Some in the alt-right movement have tried to stray away from the term in order to not retain the malicious ideals it sometimes represents, i.e. Islamophobia, xenophobia, white supremacy, and of course, the internet meme, Pepe. But more centrist alt-right-leaning members understand their cause as a grassroots movement against PC culture with a central frustration with the perceived lack of activism from more traditional conservatives and the lack of change on part of longtime Tea Party Republicans. So, let me just repeat the dichotomy there. The alt-right has been defended as a non-traditional conservative arm of younger activists, while being perceived as a group of energized conservatives who make their leading point their own interests with an emphasis on their own demographic, which has been argued as predominantly white. Now, let's make a couple points clear. Just like the alt-right, social justice warriors is a pejorative term for what has been called the far left side of the political spectrum. SJW supporters defend their position as an equalizing force for what is seen as a massive oppressive force against multiculturalism and feminism, as well as a mouthpiece for the underprivileged and undercovered minorities of America. It is, however, received as a group that is triggered on trivial issues, race baits on talking points that are neither here nor there, and overly victimizes themselves as attacked individuals from language that is sometimes seen as either dark humor or just simply taken out of context. So let's end on this note. The alt-right has its problems, that's for certain. Those of PC culture have their problems, that's for certain. The importance going forward is that our future conversations as stewards of the country we will receive from our parents will exist with the political identities we enter into it with. If we have those future conversations with the other side just being this demonized figure we've created, albeit a white racist in the alt-right or an easily triggered liberal who worships PC culture, we will never get anywhere in a civil and welcoming conversation about politics. And if we continue on this trend of continuously demonizing each other into those images we have manifested, we will never be able to see the other side for what they are. Concerned and politically motivated Americans. Thank you for joining us. Today we are going to discuss healthcare plans in America, and we will do this by discussing the new 184-page new healthcare plan from the Republicans called the American Healthcare Act. And we will also discuss the old Obamacare 984-page Patient Affordable Health Care Act. Just kidding, it's on a flash drive. First, before we go into explaining what the Republican health care plan is, otherwise known as the American Health Care Act, I'd like it if we jumped back and looked at what this new health care plan will be replacing. Obamacare. The term coined by former Governor Palin pressed that the Affordable Health Care Act put in place a death panel of politicians who would decide which Americans were worthy of medical care. The area in the Act where this stems from is in Section 1233 of the Affordable Health Care Act, which cites that paid physicians would provide counseling to Medicare patients about wills and end-of-life options. Now, although initially this was considered by Democrats to be a silly qualm, it gained such notoriety that the section was later taken out of the Act before it was enacted. Wonderful. With us today, thank you everybody, by the way, for clapping. With us today is representing the House Rebels ticket and the current Public Relations Administrator for UNLV, Fabian Donate, and representing the hashtag or Team No Sleep ticket is the current College of Health Sciences Senator Christopher Royce. Thanks for being here with us, guys. Now, before we go into the debate, let's go over the rules. Both candidates will have 2 minutes to answer the questions they have been given. If either candidate nears the end time, I will indicate either they need to wrap it up or conclude their thought. If another candidate brings up their name, I will allow that candidate brought up to give a rebuttal to the other. I will ask follow-ups on behalf of the audience if there's something that needs to be cleared up. News commentary clips like GQ's Keith Olbermann, the online hosted Rubin Report, and our focus for today, the Blaze's Tommy Lauren. Now, before we pour into Tommy Lauren, the Tommy Lauren we know today, let's explain the roots she came from in order to explain commentary platforms as a whole. It might shock you if I told you that Tommy Lauren used to host this very show. Her beginnings on television at least began with this show as it was shown on local public broadcasting as it still is to this day.
Hello and welcome to the Scramble. I'm Tommy Laren. Well, our first topic of the day involves an ongoing land dispute right here in our own backyard.
But let's hammer this technology home with how we count views outside of Facebook. If I am on YouTube and I click the video thumbnail, that is something that I initiated with action on my end, and the playback occurs because of my action. This is otherwise known as user-enabled playback. But I can't just click over and over again a million times on my YouTube video, as much as I like to do that. Failsafes work out how long a video is viewed. What IP address is being used for these views? YouTube inquires. It then asks, does 500,000 of those views for that video come from the same IP address? Yeah? Well, we cut you off with 300 views, that kind of thing. But on the other side of this subject, on Facebook, if you watch a video for 3 seconds or more, that is considered a video view. Now, if you have a page with videos like we do for the Scramble, it will show you that your views are separated into those 3-second views and above, and those 30-second views as well. It also is separated between auto-played area views and the clicked-played area views, which, as you can imagine, is much more friendly in the views in the autoplay category of things. So you can imagine if you're boasting Facebook views as we have for Tommy's videos, that isn't all that accurate, but it is, however, how things become viral in social media. The more views, the more legitimate reason to share it. The more shares, the more hubbub about it. And the more hubbub about it, the more you become a public person in the information age. The higher you go, the harder you fall, and that's not altogether new in what it takes to being a public figure. But again, just be astounded with me that in under 4 years, Tommy went from being in my seat to being hailed as a political gatekeeper and then being torn down in the public sphere. That's what political commentating and journalism means in the information age. Rapid rises to fame, viral speed and message, and public scrutiny numbering in the millions, with little time to protect yourself due to the fact that you drown in tweets, comments, and reposts. The information age is not kind to those that strive for a soapbox to stand on, but is more than willing to provide you the tools to get that big soapbox quick and speak your piece loudly. Now, I'm going to get something straight here. We do not nullify or support Tomi Lahren's political opinions. However, we will take the time to applaud the fact that she's successful in gaining a platform. That alone is an incredibly hard task. The ability of getting your own show that receives millions of views per episode is not something that just drops in your lap. Tomi has been successful in putting in the hard work of being the face of a television program. Her opinions and stances aside, she has been able to maintain steadfast in her efforts even while being rebuked from the left and the right. I wouldn't wish upon anyone the beast of public scrutiny via the angry million-man mob of social media. You don't know if you're able to handle thousands telling you to delete your account or kill yourself until you are in that hot seat. Now, you can laugh or justify off the death threats she gets, but you can do that because they aren't coming in your inbox. But till that day comes, your reaction is the real telltale sign of if you can handle being a public person. And her political opinions aside, she is successful in her efforts of being a voice box for the audience she wishes to represent. Tomi owes a lot of her platform to the tool of the internet. But just know, the internet can make you just as famous as it can make you infamous. The examples I've listed out for the past presidents were campaign commitments to be fulfilled throughout the course of 4 to 8 years, while Trump made a flurry of promises that he said he would fulfill in the first 24 hours of his sitting in office. Repeal every single Obama executive order, withdraw from TPP, suspend Syrian refugee resettlement, designate China as a currency manipulator, get rid of gun-free zones in schools and military bases, end billions of funding and climate change spending for the UN, lift environmental roadblocks to energy infrastructure projects, propose a constitutional amendment for term limits on day one, impose a complete ban on the foreign lobbyists raising campaign dollars, as well as pursue a 5-year ban on White House and congressional representatives from becoming lobbyists, and cancel federal funding for sanctuary cities. And that's the coherently explained plans. We have the plan to get rid of international gangs of thugs and drug cartels, move 2 million criminal aliens out of the country, and start work on a border wall with Mexico. This is not to say all of Trump's promises were not kept. In fact, to be fair, 2 promises were kept for his first-day commitments. The first being a hiring freeze on all federal employees to reduce the perceived bloated bureaucracy of the American government, and the second issue, a temporary moratorium on new agency regulations as to stem the tide of excessive federal policy making. And the issue brought up to mock Trump for saying his first 100 days don't represent him. Well, Obama made the same comment, saying, quote, "The first 100 days is going to be important, but it's probably going to be the first 1,000 days that makes the difference," end quote. This has been taken as Obama making an excuse to not measure him for his first 100 days, but rather over the course of his work in office. Presidents try not to abide by the comparisons of their peers going straight into a presidency, because history is usually quite fair to the concerted efforts of past presidents, as long as their endeavors are seen with the drive and intent to better the country. So a new guy coming out and patting himself on the back is not often seen, because that hand to pat is filled with responsibilities and obligations. A version of that hubris was featured in a television ad run by the Trump administration. Donald Trump has overcommitted, overstated, and oversold himself, but that's a presidential tradition. Where President Trump breaks rank is that he has excused himself from the accusation that he didn't follow through on promises. That's the unprecedented part. That's the unfortunate part.
Donald Trump, sworn in as president 100 days ago.
A president pledging something and not following through is fine. But a president saying he's fine with pledging and lying to say he followed through already is, well, a new threshold for this modern age. It's brave to say that you can accomplish inhuman feats, but it's foolhardy to boast you have already accomplished the feats that are considered inhuman. Thankfully, we have the insight into the president with constant media coverage of his promises archived into the frenzy of revisited material and his statements replayed over and over on the 24-hour news cycles. But I plead, do not take an excuse as a reason. The two are mutually exclusive. And I will admit, it is hard to discern the differences between the two. But we need to be better than our leaders and promise an honest assessment from ourselves to them, and make sure that promise is not broken. That's our time for a break. We'll be right back with a discussion on Donald Trump's first 100 days and what it means for the next 100 after this.